used to pump air into the helmet, not from a compressed air bottle, just from the environment. However, the duration that it can do this is limited by the battery in the backpack, which is probably about 8 hours. Generally speaking, you cannot communicate directly by sound to another person, so you use the radio, as you would. In the old days anyway, we used to have clumsy boots, U.S. Army cold weather boots, but the boots that went with the spacers, I think those have worn out when people are just using the hiking mistake. But we used to wear the Mickey Mouse boots, and we still do in the Arctic, where they also have the attractive feature of being appropriate for the environment. Originally, and that's another thing, the spacesuits actually have to be able to be used where you really are. When we first designed the spacesuit, someone brought in a Tiva moon boot. Said, well, this is kind of cool, and it looks like a spacesuit boot and so forth, but it couldn't take the rough terrain at all. It just fell apart. So the Army cold weather boots were reasonably tough. Now there was another issue, which was like, how do you go to the bathroom? Okay. And we thought about this, and actual spacesuits have a diaper in them. Okay. And we just at a certain point said, no. And so there is a kind of a fly. And you're not supposed to use it. It is breaking sin to do it, but if worse comes to worse, rather than pee in your pants, you just do it. Just keep in the house, the real one. The spacesuits do have water nipple. You can actually drink water while you're in the suit. But that's the limit of what you could eat or drink. So if you go out on a long EVA, leaving the ham in the morning, coming back late afternoon, you are typically hungry, but that's just how it is. And then also they would wear thick ski gloves to limit the dexterity. You very quickly find out that you want things with simple controls.
First question is for Bob and the software. My first patent, my second patent, redesigned DNA. It's not quite three-dimensional chess, but it probably is worth a lot more money. But the upshot is it will give you, we have a way of doing handheld DNA, ribosomal RNA detection of life forms. Would that be useful to you?
In a word, yes.
So we should talk.
We should talk.
I mean, the same for the engineer. You mentioned you didn't have yeast. I mean, obviously, human society has known for years and years and years that yeast adds nutritional value to the grass. Okay, and so yeast takes nothing to carry along. Of course, it replicates itself forever. It has the side advantage, disadvantage of producing alcohol as the fermentation product. Is that the reason why you don't have yeast? You don't want alcohol, but if you do want alcohol, it seems to me it would add a great deal of nutritional value, whatever you call it, at no additional.
Alcohol is a very good way, and it's to preserve water over long periods of time. Myself, back home, I have been home brewing, and I know the benefits of using alcohol to preserve water.
But there are also disadvantages, right? It means that the crew will fight with each other.
That's right.
Well, there's disadvantages as well, right? Inebriation.
Yes, but we can deal with that.
Let me just say this, one thing called a little. In the Arctic, we use a bread maker, and we do have yeast. And it's very attractive. I mean, bread, flour, is a very expeditionary food. It can be preserved for very long periods of time, and then it can be turned into a very attractive and tasty kind of food, fresh baked bread. And it was always great in the Arctic whenever someone would actually use the bread maker and make a nice big loaf of bread, fresh bread. And of course, I mean, the reason why historically, bread has been an important food for humanity, so that it can be conserved indefinitely without refrigeration, and then turned into very wholesome food. And I think having a bread maker with yeast is something that we should bring to Mars without question.
If there was no yeast, it was my fault. I'm one of the people in charge of food. At the end of every year, we have an inventory, and at the beginning of every season, we provide food with a view to holding over and using what's still in the inventory. Occasionally, something gets dropped. And occasionally they run out of yeast, or a crew won't tell us that they've used up the last of the yeast, and then the next crew gets stuck making spit bread or sourdough starter. I should say most of the crews have yeast. We did have one crew that wanted to brew beer, and we told them no. NASA has a no alcohol policy. Of course, the Russian Space Agency does not. But in a 2-week mission, it's not reasonable to brew beer because it's at least a 6-week process. So there you have it.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Kate Warren, I'm also an MDRS volunteer, refit volunteer. Yeast. I just have a general question because I know that Ian was talking about doing experiments with food and et cetera. For those crew members that are vegetarian, nutritional yeast has such high nutritional value for proteins and everything. Has any studies been done on generating yeast, since we're on the subject of alcohol and brewing notwithstanding, for nutritional and sustenance needs? It's inactive yeast is what nutritional yeast is.
Nutritional yeast that you buy at the health food store is typically it's a brewer's yeast, or sometimes it's specially grown. If it's a brewer's yeast, it's debittered to get rid of the hop flavor. And yes, it can be a useful flavorant. It's a flavor enhancer. It's a protein supplement. Our policy at MDRS is that we provide sort of a standard pantry of ingredients. If somebody has special nutritional needs, like they're a vegan or they're a kosher diner, or they are gluten-free, we provide some extra food to suit their needs. And we also, after several years of changing policies, our current policy is that if somebody wants to bring some sort of food to MDRS for their crew to use, they can do it so long as the food that they bring is the sort that you would bring to Mars. So it would be dried or canned or in a jar, and certainly nutritional yeast would satisfy those constraints. But we haven't looked at producing it on site. It's very difficult to keep things clean at MDRS, and when you are actually creating food, particularly something that's fermented, there's always a concern about contamination with other organisms that might make someone sick. Then also nutritional yeast, although it's grown wet, then it has to be dried. And we don't have the proper processing equipment there. So just as on Mars, the food processing would be quite a challenge at MDRS. So our crews generally stick to home cooking from the freeze-dried and dehydrated ingredients that we provide.
This gentleman. Well, okay, her and then
Jean, I have a question. Are you currently tracking, or will you in the future track the psychological profiles and the way different crews and different teams integrate? What makes them work and what doesn't?
In the past, there have been some crew experiments of this sort where one crew member would give surveys to the remaining crew members and kind of track moods or psychological states throughout the mission. We haven't done that recently because Such research requires an institutional review board approval, and MDRS no longer has its own IRB, and so anyone who wanted to do that kind of work would have to get IRB approval away from MDRS. We will accept that, but we don't confer that sort of approval ourselves, because there are a lot of very fine points that are really not appropriate for a volunteer remote science team to get involved in. Another thing about that is that over 2 weeks, that's a fairly short-term mission, and if we're trying to draw conclusions from a short-term mission that would apply to a long-term mission, it's difficult to do that on the basis of 2 weeks, particularly when many crews are still getting to know each other at the end of 2 weeks. So this is something that might be appropriate for the MA-80 mission, but it's something that would have to be arranged through the science team, Cheryl Bishop, and the mission director, Shannon Rupert.
Okay, this gentleman.
So, on Mars, it seems to be when you're
Use one
what? There, okay. If you're on Mars and you are out in a suit, that suit will be pressurized because the outside atmosphere is at such a low pressure. Are you using, are the suits on your missions that we're doing right now pressurized to test the ability of people to work in a pressurized suit, or do you even do that part of the time, or not?
No, they're not. That was beyond our means to provide such suits. So the limitations of the suits is, first of all, carrying around the extra weight, the limitations of potential malfunctions in the battery, in the air pack, or because the suits become extremely uncomfortable if you don't have the air blowing in time. And basically you are simulated dead. Yeah. And the clumsy gloves, the clumsy boots, the limitation of duration imposed by the electricity, limitation of communication. We don't have pressurization of the suit. It just couldn't manage it. Look, our hope, let me just address a question that hasn't been brought up. This, also, you know, Gene Hunter here is running the High Seas program, which is another Mars analog program, which has got some NASA funding, and they're doing various things out there. We started this effort. We created first the Mars Arctic Station and then the Desert Station, and began running sims with the idea of trying to learn about Mars exploration through operational simulations. We also hope to encourage others to engage in this work, and hopefully others with greater resources who could do it at greater fidelity. Okay, you know, Kim Binstead, who was Gene's co-worker on our on the High Seas, is a graduate of it. She went to FMARS in 2003, I believe. What? Oh yes, in 2007, but she might have gone earlier. MDRS, and Gene's been a participant in our program, and then they went off and started their own program. My greatest hope is that NASA will look at this and say, let's pick up the ball, let's show these people how this can really be done. In other words, the way I view our work, it's kind of like Galileo looking at the sky with his first little crude telescope. Now, he made some discoveries with that telescope, which in fact are significant ones, the moons of Jupiter, the craters of the moon, the rings of Saturn, I believe. Okay, but he did something else, is he demonstrated the utility of the telescope for astronomy. And so that subsequent to Galileo, other investigators with much better telescopes, Herschel's telescope, the Mount Palomar telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Telescope, and maybe someday the High Definition Space Telescope, have made much greater discoveries. You know, they discovered that the stars are suns. They discovered there's such a thing as the galaxy. There's such a thing as millions of galaxies. They discovered that galaxies were running away from each other, the universe was expanding, and so there was a Big Bang. Okay? They made all those other discoveries with much greater telescopes than Galileo's telescope. So the idea of this program is both to make discoveries that it can, also to inspire the public with a vision of humans exploring on Mars, very important, but also to show the scientific community the value of this kind of work so that hopefully more and more people will be doing this, including people with much greater resources who can create a higher fidelity simulation. And so, I mean, look, you know, NASA talks about, well, we have to go to the moon to practice for Mars. They could practice for the Mars pretty good in the Arctic or the Antarctic. And, you know, if they had a budget of, say, $50 million a year, okay, which is way beyond our, you know, we're doing this on a budget of like 50,000 a year. So that's 3 orders of magnitude more money, but it's insignificant for them. Okay, they could be doing the equivalent of a moon base. And yes, have fully pressurized suits and all the rest of the gear that you would want to have. Okay, so that is part of our goal with this. We want to get NASA, ESA doing this with full fidelity. And you know, look, the shrinks can have various psychological criteria for selecting individual crew members. But one thing that we have found is that the very same crew member who could be an extremely strong and valuable crew member in one crew can be a horrible crew member in another crew, okay? Because the chemistry was wrong. So that the only way you can really test Mars crews is by testing them as crews, not merely as individuals. Individuals, I mean, certain things come out with individual evaluation, but really you want to test the crew. And when they finally get around to choosing the crew that goes to Mars, they should make all the individual assessments they can, and some short duration crew studies, yes. But then for instance, take what look like 3 crack crews, okay, really good crews, and put them in 3 different Mars analog stations in different places in the Arctic, task them to do a sustained mission for a year, doing field geology and microbiology under really good, strict Mars analog protocols, and see which one works best as a team, which one holds up, which one does the best job. And then that's the crew you send to Mars. All right.
All so much. Thank you. A round of applause, please.
Is Dr. Chris Leonard here? Dr. Chris Leonard. Oh, he is here. Excellent. All right. So our next speaker will be Dr. Chris Leonard, who's a professor at George Washington University School of Medicine, and he is one of the